Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Cover Cropping Opportunities in Specialty Crops webinar series. Today we have another special guest, but very special for us, Margaret Lloyd, Dr. Margaret Lloyd, who is Small Farms Advisor in the Capital Corridor, based, I believe, out of Yolo County, but also serving Yuba, and I don't have all of the counties in front of me.
Yolo, Solano, and Sacramento.
Oh,
it's Yolo, Solano, and Sacramento Counties.
The Capital Corridor. I will introduce Margaret in a moment, but just wanted to introduce you to the team that brings this webinar series. I am Kamyar Aram, East Bay Crop Production Advisor for Contra Costa and Alameda counties. We have also Rob Benetton. If you want to introduce yourself, or
hey everybody, how are you? I'm Rob. I work with UC Cooperative Extension as the Urban Ag Advisor for the Bay Area, and I'm going to pass the mic to Julio. Thanks so much for coming.
Hi everyone, my name is Julio Contreras. I'm a Community Education Specialist with the Urban Ag Program in Alameda with UC Cooperative Extension. Ben.
Yeah, and I'm Ben Weiss. I'm with the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District. I'm the Agriculture Conservation Manager here. Excited you're joining us either now or later on YouTube.
Thanks, team. And so again, today we have Dr. Margaret Lloyd presenting to us about cover cropping and annual systems. And Margaret's going to make a presentation, and we'll have a question and answer session afterward. And so Margaret received her PhD from UC Davis in plant pathology in 2015. In fact, we were colleagues and students there together. She studied under Tom Gordon, where she researched non-chemical alternatives to soil-borne disease management in strawberries. She focused on three main topics: the role of legume rotation crops in Verticillium dahliae management, and the effect of 4 different composts on strawberry production, and also some social study research in understanding the level of adoption of soil-borne disease management tools among practitioners. She received also a master's degree in international agriculture development and plant pathology from UC Davis. And while at UC Davis, she also was behind establishing the salad bowl garden, an edible garden at the entrance of the Plant Environmental Sciences building on main campus, which I believe is still there, Margaret?
Mm-hmm.
Still active.
Yeah, and it's actually getting bigger, I just learned.
Oh. And I do remember, I don't have this in your bio, but before that you also had a business, really got started doing supporting homeowners in developing kind of larger scale production of fruits and vegetables in their backyard.
That's right.
So a very exciting and diverse background, and of course much experience with the topic at hand. So welcome, Margaret, and
thanks, Kamyar.
Looking forward to your presentation. Without further ado, I will stop sharing and pass it. Let me see if, oh, here we go, and pass it on to you.
Okay. So I think you'll have to enable my screen sharing ability.
Oh, we haven't done that. My apologies. So give me one moment and I will get that. Oh, that's right. Here we go. One moment. That should do it. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. So let's see. Are you seeing one picture or the 2 pictures with presenters now?
Yeah, we're seeing 2 pictures.
Okay.
So
let me swap screens. Is that better?
That's it.
Okay, great, thank you. So it's great to be here. My name is Margaret Lloyd, and I serve as a small farms advisor. I work with a lot of the organic mixed vegetable growers and small scale farmers in the Sacramento, Yolo, Solano area. If you ever ride the Amtrak, they call it the Capital Corridor, which heads our way. So I don't know which came first, but they're aligned, the names. So today, I'll be talking about cover crops. Why cover crop, selecting different cover crops, some basics of implementing, some of the challenges and considerations, thinking about nitrogen, and looking at cost. If you have questions, I don't mind receiving them in the talk, but it's like go through the chat. Maybe Julio will bring them to my attention so we can sort of juggle, you know, clarifications that need to be done in the moment as opposed to things that we can wait till the end. Cover cropping has a lot of benefits. When I speak with growers and look at the research, especially in our region, a few really emerge as the top benefits. Soil health, the plant health program, nitrogen budgeting, and suppressing winter weeds. When we think about those soil health benefits, specifically thinking about soil structure, so reducing compaction, and in the long term, growers can actually measure this in their reduced fuel use covering a field when there's this improved soil structure. Increased water infiltration and water holding capacity, so reduction in runoff. Increased soil organic matter, which translates into this nitrogen budgeting aspect. With more soil organic matter, has a higher capacity to mineralize and release nitrogen. But cover crops are also adding nitrogen in the short term as well as the long term. So it has those types of effects as well as from the biomass adding carbon to feed the microbes. And lastly, suppressing winter weeds. Something is going to grow when there's soil and water and sunlight. So that can be something selected or it can be weeds. When we look at the nitrogen budget in an organic production scenario, this is a conceptual figure that we have put together using data from several farms. And in the bottom here, this is the soil organic matter. And this is over time. So this is an example of like a summer season. And on the vertical axis, the y-axis, we have cumulative nitrogen release. So you can see the soil organic matter releases at a slow, steady rate during that growing season. This next slice is the cover crop piece. And so thinking about nitrogen, it actually contributes a significant portion of that following season's nitrogen, followed by some sort of a compost, in this case, in this fictitious scenario, a poultry manure compost, followed by granular fertilizer. And then this last little slice is the irrigation water. So just to give you this visual of what significance in the nitrogen budget the cover crop may be having in the fall season immediately following a winter cover crop incorporation. With cover crops, there's long and short-term benefits, and sometimes you kind of want to know what's a little bit sooner than having done this for 5-10 years. So the immediate benefits. Cereal cover crops in particular, with their deep fibrous root systems, have this ability to sort of mop up nitrogen. So utilize residual nitrogen that is sitting in the soil that either wasn't used fully by the previous crop, or that the crop residue incorporation from that previous crop is now immediately available. So especially a grass cover crop, but also legumes or brassicas, all have this ability to utilize any nitrogen that is sitting in the soil. And the benefit there is that it gets put into that crop biomass, which then you will reintroduce to the soil when it's incorporated, as opposed to during the winter rains, it would be leached and either moved below the root zone, potentially into subsurface groundwater, or runoff and surface water. It has this great benefit of providing early sources of nectar and pollen for beneficial insects. So in the organic systems where folks are really relying on this integrated pest management scenario, increasing predators, increasing pollinators. This becomes an important early spring source of pollen and nectar that can be in pretty significant amounts on a farm. It puts carbon back into the soil. So this is feeding the microbes, perpetuating high microbial activity, which has lots of benefits, including soil structure, nutrient mineralization, etc. And in a very simple sense, it keeps the soil covered. And so this protects it from all the climatic events over the course of a winter: sun, rain, wind. And when soil's not protected, we know that it physically leaves through wind or water runoff. Thinking about what is cover crop inputs doing for our organic matter and our microbes. So this is from a 8-year study by Eric Brennan. And on the bottom here, we have no compost and a cover crop application every 4th year. And when we look at the organic matter inputs, very little. Compost is this yellow dotted line with a cover crop every 4th winter. So we can see that compost is really making that big jump in organic matter. And when we cover crop every year, then we can actually take it a little bit further, combining compost with cover cropping. It's a little different story when we look at microbial activity. I'll get back to that one in a second. So this is looking at microbial biomass. So the same scenario where we have no compost and just cover cropping every 4th year, we sort of hover around 0 change in the microbial biomass and maybe even a little bit of a loss. When we add compost to a cover crop every 4th year, we see a little boost in microbial biomass. But once we add cover cropping every year, that's when we see this really significant jump in microbial biomass. So that's an important role that the cover crops are playing, and why doing them every year becomes relevant. It's feeding these microbes, building this microbial activity in the soil, which has so many other effects. When we look at how these scenarios affect yields, again, we have the red, which is the no compost and legume rye cover crop every 4th year. And then we have the yellow, which is adding compost to that, which is not that different. So here on the green is when we start cover cropping every year. That's where, again, the benefits now translate into an increased yield. So that was some of the work of Dr. Eric Brennan, USDA researcher on the Central Coast. And here he's describing that most of the benefit comes from this annual cover crop, and his data shows that non-legume cover crops, rye and mustard, can also provide this benefit. So sometimes we can get focused on the legumes because of their nitrogen fixing ability, but really all cover crops are providing this food source and building the soil structure. A local organic grower who's been farming very successfully for his whole life, decades, says here that while adding compost is an easy way to boost the organic matter, he points out cover cropping has slower, more cumulative benefits to microbes and soil health over the long term. So both the growers and the researchers are really seeing the benefits of this regular cover cropping. So thinking about how to select cover crops, they're simply spoken divided into these 3 categories: legumes, cereals, and brassicas. So we'll look at each of those. I wanted to share this resource with you. This is developed by the NRCS, and this is this cover crop chart. They show sort of a map of cover crops for all over California, and each of these in one of these boxes has a page like this, and it can sort of get the basics of that crop. And some important aspects might be the seeding rate, the biomass, some of the pest alerts. So just to let you know this is available to you. Legume cover crops. Legume cover crops are unique in their ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen. And this occurs localized in the roots through a symbiotic relationship between nitrogen-fixing bacteria called Rhizobia, forming a symbiotic relationship with the plant roots. And this is not a free exchange. Plants are exchanging carbohydrates through photosynthesis for this nitrogen. So energetically, it's estimated that about 20% of the photosynthase a plant produces in its lifetime goes to exchanging it for nitrogen with these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And so this is occurring in the roots. And because of that energetic expense, if there is freely available nitrogen in the soil, legumes will use that before fixing their own nitrogen. Some examples of legume cover crops are going to be peas, fava beans, vetch. They each have their own qualities, peas being a little bit more slow growing, less biomass. Fava beans are somewhat aphid attracting, but they have very good vertical growth. And vetch has excellent growth. It has, because it's vining and prostrate, it shades out weeds pretty quickly, and it's more succulent. So fava beans have stronger, more lignified stems or stalks, whereas vetch remains a little bit more succulent longer. So this is an example of what a vetch-only cover crop looks like. Vetches have a very low C to N ratio. And here's an example of maybe 12 to 15 C to N. And the significance of this is that there'll be a net release of nitrogen to the environment or to your crop, your following crop. So when thinking about how much you might be relying on your cover crop for a source of nitrogen, knowing this C to N ratio becomes important. Also, this ability to quickly decompose is important for your timing to return back in. Different types of vetches, so there's common vetch, purple vetch, hairy vetch, for example, have different timings. So becoming familiar with when common vetch or purple vetch might perform in your area. Around us, the common vetch flowers a little bit earlier, so this is better for an early termination. You're going to get more biomass earlier, whereas purple vetch will go a little bit later, so you may not have to worry about seed becoming a problem and or this shift from from flowers to seed, in which your nitrogen starts to go down. So if you're going to be adding, incorporating, terminating it later, you'll be wanting a crop that's not going to be going into that reproductive stage as early, because that will be robbing your field of some nitrogen. One thing to note about some of these legumes, and this was some of the research that Kalmyar referenced during my PhD, is that legumes can support the growth and development of Verticillium dahliae. So if you have this pathogen, this is important to be aware of. And so through this research, I just found sort of a differentiating scale between different varieties and their ability to host this pathogen. So if you have Verticillium, hairy vetch, and bell bean would be better choices. They're not as good of a host for the pathogen. Whereas if you have Verticillium, common vetch would be a poor choice, because Verticillium dahliae colonizes it very well and reproduces very well on common vetch. Adding inoculant. So inoculant is basically adding rhizobial strains, and Rhizobia are present and sometimes abundant naturally in soils. However, there are different shall I say, efficiencies between these rhizobial strains. And so this image is such a neat, really neat research. And what it is showing is the bargaining strategy between roots and Rhizobia. So not all Rhizobia are taking carbohydrates and giving nitrate at the same ratio. And so the goal for a grower or for a plant would be to have to take as little sugars from the plant and get the most nitrogen from the Rhizobia. And so on the x-axis here, we have the Rhizobia. And so the bigger the Rhizobia, the more benefit the Rhizobia is getting. Whereas in the y-axis vertically, the higher the seed yield, the more the plant's getting, right? So what we want basically is to have, you can see my cursor, is that right? So we want to have the, from a plant perspective, the best scenario over here, because that's getting the best yield with the lowest trade-off to the Rhizobia. So that's where this star is. And this is an inoculum strain developed by the USDA. So while you very likely have rhizobial strains and you'll get these inoculations in your field, the naturally occurring Rhizobia in your field may not be the most efficient or the most fair Rhizobia. So that can be a benefit or a reason to consider adding an inoculant to your soil. Moving on to mustards. So these are in the brassicas. Insects tend to love mustards. So in the vegetable cropping scenario, mustards can promote insect population buildup early in the season. So this is certainly something to be conscientious of and sensitive to. Mustards tend to have somewhat less biomass than a legume or a cereal crop. They don't fix nitrogen, so they're more similar to cereal crops in that way. They don't have the extensive root system in the way that a cereal crop does. They do have early bloom, and so they can be a good source of food for the pollinators. So well, I'm not very excited about mustards in the context that I work in, which is this organic mixed vegetable scenario where we're really focused on getting a lot of biomass, getting some nitrogen back in. These are getting terminated later in the spring, so March, April easily. And we're really careful about insect buildup. Mustard's not a great fit in that scenario. Whereas in some other cases, like a lot of times you see mustard more commonly in the orchard scenario or the vineyard scenario, where maybe a lot of biomass is a problem, or they're going to be terminated really easy. So you want that biomass built up much more early, and you want that bloom early on. So there's different motivations and scenarios and reasons to pick different crops. Cereals. Commonly used in the mixes are going to be cereals like oats and barley and rye and triticale. Triticale and rye have somewhat larger root balls. This can be challenging for the decomposition timing because depending on what you're going in with after, if you have some fine seeding that you need to do, these root balls can be a problem. Barley and rye do really well in the cool weather. So depending on how cold your weather is, or if you're trying to get this in later in the year, like in December, and trying to get that germination, that would be a reason to consider one over the other. And very common are these mixes. So they're going to be legume only mixes or legume with a cereal crop. And of course, these have different types of benefits, and sometimes these can be risk mitigation strategies. And what I mean by that is, you know, the nitrogen scavenging roots of the cereal crops can get all that residual nitrogen, whereas the legumes will then be able to make their own once that soil residual nitrogen is used up, so you can still get a good amount of biomass, things like that. Tillage radish has had interest in our area. People are exploring new crops. This is done a lot more in other parts of the country, and that's because very cold wintertime temperatures terminate the tillage radish. So in our area, I would say it's still experimental. And one of the things to consider is there's a huge range in biomass production. So we see 12,000 down to 3,000. So the average is 6,000 pounds per acre of dry mass, but a huge standard deviation, a huge amount above and below that. So picking the variety based on what your goal is it biomass? Is it just to get diversity? Things like that will be important. So I just wanted to bring your attention to that. The Lockford Plant Material Center in Lockford, California, that's about 40 miles south by southeast of Sacramento. They do these huge cover crop variety trials, and they put out these reports. So these reports are where I got information like the amount of biomass, the varieties, the production, etc. So that's another resource at your disposal. And they regularly put on cover crop workshops and meetings and stuff. This was one that I sort of picked up on a little bit more fully watching Billy Sykes' presentation a few weeks ago here.
Really Sync, yeah.
Sync, okay, I knew that was a little off. Thank you. That was like Bill Sykes, that's from Oliver, the musical. And so this was a really interesting table. And this is looking at poor quality pollen. So how good are these cover crops as a pollen source? And as I mentioned before, this is a really valuable part of cover crops, a sort of secondary benefit. So some cover crops that we grow in the wintertime would be vetch and fava bean, and that's in this average quality pollens, pretty good. I think some interesting ones, lupin. So this could be a really interesting one, worth exploring, especially if early pollen and nectar sources are one of your goals. And I just wanted to, I circled a couple others because of the interesting comparisons. So citrus and lavender are on the poor quality, buckwheat, sunflower, blueberry, maize, all on this lower end. And that was just kind of surprising. We do often hear about the wonderful pollen quality of almond, but also these clovers. So I found this to be a really valuable and insightful table. Phacelia is another interesting one. This is a native plant in California, and folks are incorporating this into their cover crops. It's a great source of pollen and nectar and attracting beneficial insects. So it's listed in the top 20 pollen producing flowers for honeybees, and it's highly attracted to pollinator insects. And it blooms during that time frame. So it'll be blooming in April, which for us in the Central Valley is easily a time when our cover crops are still up, and we're really trying to attract some of those. It's a real transition time, so there can be less food sources during that time. So this becomes really valuable. So this is a really fun one to consider, and it grows really easily. So how to choose? It's really based on what your needs are and what your goals are. Are you trying to add nitrogen, build soil structure, capture residual nitrogen? What's the timing of your activity? And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but especially on the termination side. How much trash can your next crop tolerate? So how much biomass or those root balls in the soil can you tolerate next crop? Are you going to be direct seeding? Are you going to be transplanting? Are they big crops, little crops, etc.? And if you have any insect or disease concerns. So there's multiple things to consider when selecting your cover crop. The cost could be a scenario. So these are some pricing from Lockwood, TSNL, which are two very commonly used places around us. So there's some organic and some conventional. So you can get an idea there. This is the cost for this mix, 75 cents a pound. And this is what some of these cover crops look like in our area. So this was like the first 2 weeks of April. This was a mix of a fava bean. You can see some cereal. This was oats and some vetch. And there is pea, but the pea can always be a little bit hard to spot. I think here's a little pea down here. This is a vetch only cover crop. This is a wheat field. This was not actually a cover crop. This was a production wheat field, but it would look the same. So thinking about, we'll go back to that in a minute. Let's talk about preparation. Are there any questions that folks would like to ask at this point? Okay. So thinking about preparation, basically, bed preparation is the same as you would do for a crop. And the only exception would be that generally cover crops are not fertilized. Sometimes folks add compost in the fall for their spring crops, but the sentiment is not that you're fertilizing the cover crop, but that you're adding compost for the subsequent crop. So that sometimes will happen. The same goals are there, this need for good soil to seed contact. So really no different there. Flat field versus beds, it can be done both ways. And it kind of depends on what works for you. How are you going to seed them? What are you putting in after? Some folks like to have their beds ready, so they're ready to go into them in the spring. With the beds, you can have better drainage. They're ready for the spring. Maybe if you have buried drip, that's already in. So both work well. A stanhay planter, there's kind of a fun video here, which I'm not going to show you for the sake of time, but you can Google Eric Brennan. This is how to convert a stanhay, which many vegetable growers have, so that you can use it to direct seed your cover crop and not have to buy a drill seed, which is the most commonly way that cover crops are planted, but it does become a unique piece of equipment for cover cropping. If you don't grow cereal crops like wheat, or something like that for your farm, a drill seed might just be used for cover cropping. So that's why that can be neat. Of course, you can get seed in any number of ways. Drill seeding, you have good coverage and establishment, but it can be broadcasted, it can be pushed behind seeder. Let's see, I have a couple of examples. You know, this is one that you just walk around and it sprays it out. It can be a push behind like that. Seeding rate in our area, the range is probably 60 to 120, and most are in this 80 to 100 pounds per acre. Choosing a high seeding rate is usually driven by having higher weed pressure. When you're broadcasting seed, so you might not get as good of a stand, so you sort of overseed. And any other reasons that you might know of on your farm for having low germination. Maybe you know you're not going to have great seeds soil contact, for example. So any other reason for low germination, you would choose a higher seeding rate. Okay, managing your cover crop. Generally, cover crops are treated the same way as any other crop on your field. It's an economic investment, it's a time investment, it's an investment for your soil quality. And so keeping it on your radar in the same way you would any other crop becomes important. So one activity that might be done would be mowing the edges. Irrigation is an interesting one, which we will talk about more fully in just a second. Yeah. So why irrigate? Some folks irrigate pre-plant the way they would preparing for a cash crop as a weed management strategy. So get those weeds up and then plant into it. Pre-irrigation can also help bridge this sort of unknown time frame of waiting for the winter rains. So the reason to get a cover crop up a little bit earlier than maybe a winter rain, or the risk of having a very late winter rain, would be to get good germination before the cold weather, like if we don't have our first rain until December, but also B, get some biomass on your cover crop before it gets really cold. So you can increase your biomass. You can make sure to get a cover crop established when it's a little bit warmer out. And so that can be a reason to pre-plant, irrigate. Getting the cover crop in a, as I just mentioned, more biomass, better establishment. So for example, a one-time irrigation in October could be 1 inch to 1.5 inches. And then one time during the season. And for these same reasons, basically making sure you have biomass and making sure you get some growth. Because if you don't get that biomass growth, A, you might not outcompete weeds enough. B, you might not get the biomass you want in order to get the nitrogen benefits, the organic matter benefits, the root growth benefits. Some common comments around here is that no rains by early December, I'm putting on irrigation. Thinking to yourself about, is it worth the cost? Well, another way to think about that is, what's the cost of that nitrogen that you might be counting on? What did it cost you to establish it? And is it worth maintaining that now? Terminating cover crop, you can do this any number of ways. Basically chopping it up and disking it in and giving it some time to decompose. This can be done by animals too. So terminating cover crops, this is often a logistical decision, but some things you can think about if you have the opportunity to select times or to make some decisions on your timing is that by the time the flower, you see flowers on your cover crop, contain 3 to 4% nitrogen, and that's on the high side. So if you're really wanting higher nitrogen, you're wanting that to terminate at that point in time. Once your cover crop, whether it's a legume or a mustard or a cereal crop, shifts into that reproductive stage and starts putting up seed head, that's when they're starting to translocate the nitrogen that was in the leaf tissue into the reproductive part of the plant. And that's when your nitrogen levels start to go down in the leaf tissue and your carbon to nitrogen ratio goes up, and you sort of shift when you can expect that nitrogen on your farm. And here's a picture, or sorry, a figure of the nitrogen concentration on the x-axis and availability. So as you can see, when you have a higher percent nitrogen, you have much more available nitrogen over the course of the following summer, in this case of a winter cover crop. And the lower that nitrogen percent goes, the lower the availability goes. So that 3 to 4% is right in here. And once you go into that reproductive phase, this just starts to decline. Some challenges and considerations. So thinking about your weed suppression, making sure that you have competition out there for those weeds. Your timing to terminate cover crop, the impact of the residue in the following crop, and thinking about your spring conditions and your logistical calculations. So we'll go through each of those. So for weed suppression, we already covered this, higher seeding rate, and that will help you outcompete some of those weeds. Drilling will help with better establishment. Earlier planting time will help outcompete some of those weeds, and a pre-irrigation so that you can do a weed cultivation prior to sowing. So those are some suggestions for how to, if weed suppression is a big one for you, how to really maximize that. Timing. The timing is a huge one for cover crops, and that's because in the winter time, winter/springtime activities are really driven by soil moisture and our ability to get into the field with heavy equipment to do the work that needs to be done to both incorporate a cover crop, give it time to decompose, and prep the field for a following crop, and then transplant that crop. And when we have unpredictable rains, that can put our crops at risk. So it's really important for when you're deciding which fields to cover crop to focus on what are you putting in there and what kind of flexibility do you have in the springtime, or what is the planting date in the springtime. In our area, March is still a risky window and can be hard to get all those activities done in order to get a March planted crop in. Those crops that are really important, if you're a diversified vegetable grower, for example, the crops that are really important for your economic impact on your farm really have to be committed to their timing and their success. And so they may or may not work with the risks associated with the cover cropping. So in our area, early planted tomatoes are generally not, do not follow a cover crop. And in general, it's hard to do this rapid turnaround for vegetable crops. So spring crops like carrots and those other spring crops likely don't follow a cover crop. But, you know, we're thinking we'll cover which crops those are, but some of those later summer crops. And so, you know, it's worth asking how much biomass and what's the biomass nitrogen benefit that you may get if you really shorten this window. That still requires a lot of activities to be done during a time when we have unpredictable rains, January, February. But termination was to happen in January. Is that 3-month window worth it? And, you know, it could be. So what's the impact of the residue on the next crop? This is also a really important consideration when choosing whether or not cover crops are going to be right for you. So for example, fine seeded crops can be hard to get in when there's lots of residue. So even carrots in the fall, which means they've had the whole summer, that can still be a tricky one to follow after a cover crop that had some cereal in it. So these crops are good examples, in our area at least, of things that we grow that really do great after cover crops. So all of these tend to be later planted summer vegetables. And, you know, thinking more long term, those fall vegetables, those fall crops in our area, we're even putting them in August, September. That's not too long after April incorporation of a cover crop. So they're still going to get those benefits. Strawberries around here can also go in August or November. So there's lots of options. Thinking about nitrogen and our cover crops, this becomes a really hard, this is somewhat of a hard estimation to make, but we'll cover that briefly. So nitrogen, when we look at our cover crop, we think about biomass, the above ground biomass. The amount of that material is going to reflect largely how much nitrogen is in that cover crop. So even if that cover crop was a legume, where you have nitrogen fixation occurring in the roots, that nitrogen is not staying in the roots, it's being translocated into all the above ground biomass. So legume or cereal crop or anything, it's in the biomass. That's where the nitrogen is. When that gets incorporated it's estimated that of the total nitrogen that was in that cover crop, 100 pounds, 200 pounds, 4 to 35% of it becomes available to the following crop. So that's a really good range to have in mind. A lot of things can influence how you can estimate what number between 4 and 35. I know that feels like a large range, but it's a good starting place. Now, if we only get 35% of that nitrogen, where's the rest of that nitrogen going? That nitrogen is going into building your soil organic matter and being stored in that soil organic matter. And so if you recall that first figure I showed you with the relative contributions, those bands with all the different colors, remember that bottom one was the soil organic matter. And so that significant chunk, that's where, you know, that is built up from previous cover crops, from previous compost applications, etc. So you're getting it, just not immediately. And yeah. So here's kind of another conceptual drawing showing a legume and nitrogen fixation, and you incorporate that, it breaks down and becomes available. This is oversimplified, but it may help with that story. So when we look at some common cover crops, on the left-hand column, you can see bell beans, lana vetch, all the way up to the mustards. You can get a sense of the range in biomass. So you've got 4 tons for the oats, 2 tons for your vetches and peas, and the tissue content, right? So these vetches and peas, you've got low biomass, high tissue end content. And when you multiply your biomass times your tissue end content, that gives you the total nitrogen in the crop biomass. Now let's take the oats scenario. You have high biomass, lower tissue end content, and you have 149 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Let's take low biomass in the vetch, high percent N, and you have 140 pounds per acre. Pretty similar. So you can get this very similar amounts in different ways. Now, when we think about this 4 to 35% availability, this lower number is your total nitrogen times 4%. So of 153 pounds, 4% of that's going to be 6 pounds to the acre, or at 35% of the total, you might get 54 pounds to the acre. So you can see basically maybe 60 pounds of nitrogen is on the high end. So it might be 0 to 60 pounds, 10 to 60 pounds. That's going to be the range that one could expect to get out of a cover crop that following season. And this is the scenario of a winter cover crop followed by a summer growing season. When we take a little bit of thinking about the timing of that, so this is time, days after transplanting. In this case, it's a tomato. And this is nitrogen derived from this cover crop. So of all of the nitrogen that tomato was using or taking up, how much of that came from the cover crop? So in the first month, basically, 16% of that total nitrogen came from the cover crop. And then it decreased. And so what that's telling us is that that nitrogen from the cover crop is mineralizing very quickly, and it's available very early on in the season. And the longer we go through the season, the less of that's available. And that's because it was already made available and the plant used up what it could. So that's your timing piece. And that's what you can also see here in this figure. This is also time. In the first, here's 8 weeks. you know, this is about 4 weeks. So 4 to 6 weeks is usually that time frame of cover crop mineralization. So breakdown, mineralization. Incorporating it versus leaving it on the surface. It will lead to faster release and more stable and more nitrogen. It becomes available earlier when it's incorporated. And this is because you really want this surface contact with the microbes. They're the ones that are doing that breakdown activity and making it available. When it is left on the surface, you're relying a lot more on external moisture, so rain maybe, to move some of that soluble nitrogen down, soluble carbon, keeping that moisture conduit available for either chewing organisms or the microbes themselves. Fungi are the primary decomposers of lignin and cellulose, and they really thrive in moist conditions. So that's sort of the scenario, and part of the reason why surface residue is not as quickly decomposed and will not get as much nitrogen availability in the short term. So a little bit of a review. So what's affecting how much you're going to get? It's the amount of biomass you get. It's that N content of your leaf tissue. It's your C to N ratio, right? The higher the C to N ratio, the less you're going to get in the short term. And incorporating it. The more it's trapped and incorporated, the more accessible that material is to the microbes and the more decomposition, mineralization that will occur. A lot relies on knowing your biomass and nitrogen content of your material. And this can be done in such a simple way. I really encourage folks to do this at least once. It becomes a really useful tool to training your eye. So what you do is make a square, and in this case, this is made with PVC. It's measured out to 3 feet by 3 feet. And basically you cut all the material within that square all the way down to the ground, dry it out, and then weigh it. And from 3 by 3, so 9 square feet, you can then estimate how much biomass you have per acre. So that tells you a lot about what you got out there and how you're doing with that cover crop. And then for $25, you can take that dry material and send it to your local lab and get your N content. And through that process, you then have real numbers about what's going on in your field. And that's so exciting and so informative. And like I said, through this process, you can at least be your eye to what to expect out there. Because when you start using some of those, as I shared, where they have some of that data, you'll see a really big range. And those ranges can make it so that you are getting anywhere from 10 to 100 pounds. So it can be hard to use other folks' data in making a reasonable estimation for your own farm. So I've been doing that myself with my growers, going to their fields. These were all taken this first and second week of April, and doing some sampling and trying to train our eyes. So how big were these cover crops? This is just under 3 feet. We've got this one, which is just under 5 feet, etc. And through this process, starting to know, well, yeah, what does it look like here in Yolo? And in our area, here's biomass, for example. When we have a legume only cover crop, we're getting in the 4,200 to 4,500 pounds per acre of dry biomass. So that's just over 2 tons. When we add in oats, we now get to the 5,600, 5,800. So just under 3 tons. So that was really because they had different seeding rates, different planting dates, even though these are essentially all the same planting date because they're relying on the same winter rains. And then we can look at the total nitrogen. So recall this situation with the legumes. We get less biomass, but higher total N% in the leaf tissue. And with once we start getting the cereal crops in, we do get more biomass, but then we start to lower the percent nitrogen in the tissue. And this is the important piece here. In the legumes, you've got 12-to-1 carbon to nitrogen, whereas once you have these cereal crops, you get the 17, 18-to-1. And so when we look here in the range, it's pretty close, right? 58 to 66 pounds, 56 to 63. However, that carbon to nitrogen ratio is going to be a big factor for where you choose your number on that scale. So with the legumes being 12-to-1, you're going to get closer to that 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Whereas with the 17 to 18-to-1 ratio, you're probably going to get closer to that 10 or 20 pounds of nitrogen to the acre. So that carbon to nitrogen ratio is very informative for estimating release rate in the short term. And here's a really interesting one. So this grower had the exact same cover crop. These were neighboring fields, in fact, and they didn't get the second field in until January 15th. So same cover crop, neighboring field, same seeding rate. You can see what the difference is. So, you know, I harvested these both the first week of April, 3,500 pounds to the acre versus 5,800 pounds to the acre. More biomass planted earlier, of course, but lower plant tissue N and higher plant tissue N. And then we also see that later planted one didn't have a higher C to N ratio, right? So I hope that these concepts are starting to come together. Earlier has higher tissue and content, lower C to N ratio, which means more availability in the short term. But more biomass planted earlier is going to have less total plant tissue N, but will go more towards building soil fertility in the future. And here's what that picture looked like. So this in the foreground is that January planted cover crop, and in the background you can see the November planted cover crop, about twice as tall. What are the costs of the cover crop? So when we look at some typical activities, which are sort of standard practice for bed prep, a good quick sketch is about $180 per acre. I had a grower tell me that his guess is $150. So probably in this $150 to $200 could be a decent window for how much a cover crop might cost a grower. What are some of the other costs and trade-offs? So if you're growing a cover crop, that means you're not growing a cash crop. So you're sacrificing a fall cash crop in exchange for investing in your following year's crop. And so this becomes a question of how much is that following crop worth to you, and are the benefits worth it to you? You can also think about some of the nitrogen dollar value as another way to think about it. And so though cover cropping does cost more upfront, a farmer might not see the benefits in the first year or two. In 5 or 10 years, the benefits emerge and the costs even out over time. And that was from Jim Durst, a local organic grower. And just to review the figure I showed before, so now you have this soil organic matter that you're building through cover cropping, through composting and other activities. And in the short term, this is the cover crop you'll be getting, that 4 to 35% is coming out in this bar, that sliver. So in summary, plant cover crops, they have a lot of benefits. You don't need to get hung up in which exact cover crops you plant. You know, if you do a monocrop, if you do a cereal mix, if you do some experimental crops, they all provide benefits. So I encourage you to go for it. Their main benefits are going to be really strongly seen in terms of soil structure, nitrogen management, and winter weed suppression. How do you grow cover crops? Basically treat them like a crop. Do focus on your crop. Don't compromise your following crop for your cover crop. Consider irrigation. It can be worth it. Do you want to explore Phacelia, lupin, daikon radish? Think about the timing of your seed sowing. Do you want to put in some water in October? Wait for winter rains in November, December? Experiment with a late planting in January and see if you can get enough biomass. It can be done on the beds or the flat field, whichever you feel like is easier or better sets you up for the springtime, or your soil structure might do better with. And consider inoculating with a legume inoculant. And that's what I have to share today about cover crops.
Thank you
Bravo!
so much.
Yeah, thank you for
Bravo.
your attention, everybody.
Yeah, that was a wonderful and very thorough presentation. I had several times questions pop up that you answered immediately in the following slides. So,
Oh, good.
Kudos. We do have a few questions here.
Great.
And I have questions too. So I think if we have some time for a little bit of discussion. The first question, actually, this comes up a lot. Of course, you're up there in the southern Sacramento Valley, but Yolanda is wondering if you can recommend local soil testing lab. I also wonder always, you know, this comes up a lot. How should growers and others kind of go about trying to find a good lab?
Sure. I mean, a good starting place is to ask your local farm advisor, or to, I'm sure the NRCS, RCD offices are also very familiar, but, or even just your local farmers. But, you know, in our area, I think it's also usually quite nice to have a lab that you can go to and not have to pay for shipping. So like whether Woodland is your neighborhood, or Davis or Sacramento, there's a lot of ag high quality labs in a lot of parts of California. So let's see.
And I could say to that, you know, Yolanda, please go ahead and reach out to me or to Rob Benetton, and that'll be a good incentive for us to start compiling lists that we can share with you all. So
yeah, and for Yolanda, this is Ben Weiss with Contra Costa. I'm actually going to post a link for you really quick. This was a list of recommended soil sampling labs that applicants to the Healthy Soils program use. It's maintained by CDFA, and there's a couple all throughout. So feel free to poke around. This is what I send when people ask me. And I actually answered that question today to someone else in another email. So we get this question a lot.
Yeah, it's probably my #1 question.
Wow.
I'd like to add just one quick thing. In some cases, in some of the cooperative extension units of each of the counties, some of the Master Gardener Program units actually manage a soil lab, analytical lab list, which depending on the county may be updated every so often. I know this is the case in, I think it was Napa or Sonoma, and then also Alameda. I know it's not consistent throughout all the counties, but certainly many of them.
Yeah, so this is my website, and in the General production tools, soil sampling. I have my list posted also. And here you go. So you can look by region. And if you're looking for other things, nematodes, and I have guidelines here as well.
Super. Very good resources, and I think we'll find a way to share your website as well down the line. We have another question that I think is actually, yeah, it was on my mind too. So Derek asks, could you please share more thoughts about the line between incorporating cover crops into soil without soil tillage? So you did discuss a little bit about the advantages of incorporation into the soil. But in situations where folks are doing no-till, or if they're doing livestock grazing, do you know much about how those different methods, might make the best use of the nitrogen available in the crop?
Yeah, well, I think that, as may have been communicated, a lot of these decisions are based on your own goals. And so if you want to, if you are doing no-till, then I think recognizing that there will be less nitrogen in the cover crop becomes important, because one of the things that I think that sometimes happens with no-till can be a tie-up of nitrogen or just less nitrogen availability. So sometimes that can mean that one might need to actually supplement with nitrogen in a no-till scenario as opposed to the same field in which it was tilled. So that would be one example in which, recognizing what's going on and addressing it proactively. Was there more to the question?
Well, there was also the question about if animals are used to terminate the crop, so grazing.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, animals do a great job terminating cover crops, and they do a great job in the sense that they can chew it all up and turn it into manure. On the real immediate sense, whatever crop you're going into has to be able to deal with the raw manure. And by that, I'm really thinking about a food safety sense. So, you wouldn't want to put a crop that grows low to the ground. And, legally, there's a time frame anyway between the application of raw manure followed by certain crops. So that, of course, is a consideration. But, something like a tomato, which is in the ground for a long time and does not rest on the soil, would be a fine crop, among many others, to grow following animal grazing. Animals one concern is compaction with animals. And so that can be challenging in springtime when you might need to get your cover crop down, or the animals are there when we get rain and it gets too wet and they can compact the soil. So that can be another challenge, or just something to keep in mind with the animal rotations.
Super, thank you. And I have a few follow-up questions really on this particular topic. One you've already mentioned, but I'm curious how growers that given the wide range of potential nitrogen release from cover crops, how do they plan their nitrogen fertilization?
Good question. I think that, at least in the organic scenario, folks have kind of figured out how much they need to add to get the yields that they want, which doesn't necessarily mean that they've done all the calculations to know how much is coming from the cover crop, how much is coming from the soil organic matter, how much is coming from all these sources, because it's genuinely complex and challenging. I'm actually teaching a workshop right now for organic growers to try to work through some of that. Because even with the soil amendments, whether that be compost or a 442 fertilizer or something, one is not getting all of the nitrogen from that material. And so I would probably venture to say that a lot of this is figured out by trial and error and by how your crop is performing based on what you did, and then making adjustments. And so when you actually do some of these calculations and actually estimate soil organic matter release and cover crop release and how much is coming from your irrigation water, it actually, and then do the reductions for how much is actually not being released from your fertilizer this year or your compost this year, we often find that it does total up to the 200 pounds or whatever is needed or close to it. But I think, you know, growers get there in a different way than a scientist would get there.
Yeah, definitely get the feeling that there's a lot of art to cover cropping as well as science, and definitely have heard from growers that it takes time and experience to kind of figure out how it works in their specific situation.
Yeah.
But I did have this other question related, kind of related really, again, to incorporating or terminating. And I want, you mentioned at the very beginning of, you know, that you could plant into beds as well as flat ground. And in some cases, I know folks make pre-made beds for the following year for the, you know, for the springtime for the crop. And I'm curious in terms of what your experience is with growers in terms of how well the beds hold up, whether you can incorporate in any way into a bed without destroying it, you know, just kind of what are practices when you want to have beds in place in the following spring and you also want to grow a cover crop on them?
Yeah. So, I mean, it kind of just depends on what your equipment is and how you set up your equipment so that you can incorporate and maintain the bed structure. So, and it also will depend on how, you know, what kind of beds are needed for the following crop. So, you know, but I think it can be done. I mean, I think basically the equipment and setting up your equipment is the driver for maintaining your beds. You know, you can have shovels running behind your cultivators or whatever you're using to incorporate it to basically try to reshape it after incorporating.
Very good. I have other questions, but I don't want to monopolize the field. Let's see, we have a new question popped up here from Yolanda. Do you need to mulch cover crops while waiting for germination, or does it serve as its own mulch? So I'll just interpret that a little bit too and say, so if we're talking when we seed, I guess you can have mulch from a previous crop if you're going in without too much prep. But so basically, is there a concern about kind of how should we cover the cover crop seeds at seeding? Yeah. And
no mulch is necessary. The seeds do need to be incorporated in the, you know, somehow put into the soil so that you have that seed soil contact, like they can't just remain on the surface. That would be a very poor germination and stand. But, you know, once those seeds are incorporated, whether through a drill seeder or coming in after a broadcast, then they can just remain there until there's a winter rain or until a irrigation event occurs. But no mulch is necessary.
So kind of getting back to a question around nitrogen. I wonder what you know about, there are new rules about kind of nutrient runoff from croplands. And do you know, to any extent, have growers that you're aware of kind of you started to use cover crops as a way to, as you mentioned early on, kind of for mining nitrogen and keeping it in the field as a, to keep it from being in the runoff?
Mm-hmm. At this point, as far as I understand, there's no sort of regulatory perk or motivation to grow a cover crop, even though it has that potential to be capturing residual nitrogen that would be otherwise a potential environmental contaminant through winter rains. So at that point, it's upon the grower to be motivated to prevent that, but maybe from a more economic or production standpoint, by capturing it, that is then saving it and putting it back into your own system. So if it is lost to the environment through surface runoff or pushed below the root zone, then that is nitrate that was lost, and that has a economic cost, and that will need to be replaced. So a cover crop can capture that and then store it in its above ground biomass and be incorporated in the spring. So it is a way to basically delay available nitrogen when you're not quite ready for it. It might be ready from that crop you had in the summer or residual from the summer crop, but you want it for your spring crop. So that cover crop can provide that bridge to carry that nitrogen over. So yes, there is the environmental perk in that you're preventing it from being a pollutant. But despite the regulatory demands right now, there's not, there's no return to the grower for that type of work.
Julio has a question. I think I will let him ask it.
Thank you. Great presentation, Margaret. I have a number of questions. I'll start off with the first one, which is regarding irrigation. So you mentioned if you want to get the plant established soon or quickly, especially if there's no rain, then you can irrigate and water then. And then you also mentioned increasing the biomass. And so I'm curious, at what point would it be best to water to make the most out of the water that farmers would be paying for? Would that be like early on an establishment, or like halfway before termination, or what point?
Yeah, I mean, it really has to play it by ear. And, typically a grower might have to irrigate once, maybe twice. So that's kind of the range we're talking about. Once, maybe twice, 0 to 2 times. And so the first consideration is going to be that germination in the fall. And that's, like I said, because you want to get that crop up and established and going while it's not too cold and the day length is too short, but be able to get some of that biomass up and going before we get that, cold, dark, short days. And then a second time could be if we really do have a drought year and you're not getting that growth, maybe again in the, mid-late winter. But I don't hear about that happening a lot. It seems like we're getting more rain in the springtime than we do in the fall. So that, tends to be what's happening anyway. But I think that could be a tough decision whether to do it irrigate a second time or not. Yeah.
Do we have time for another question, Kamya?
We have time for a few more, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
As long as. Go ahead.
So I imagine one of the methods to increase you mentioned the 4 to 35% number that influences, one of those would be irrigation. Are there the ones that farmers can do to increase that?
Yeah, that's a fun question. So that 4 to 35% is about availability. So the things that are driving availability are going to be your C to N ratio. So a lower C to N ratio is going to mean that you're going to have more availability. A lower C to N ratio is going to happen with less mature plants, younger plant tissue. So, you know, you're thinking about, so earlier in the season, for example, less lignaceous material, right? So the vetches as opposed to a fava bean, or the vetches as opposed to a cereal crop. So the type of crop you're growing. That window of, you know, the common thing that you might hear in a cover crop workshop is, you know, the best time for termination is at, you know, 0 to 50% flower. And that's because that's where you have this threshold of most amount of biomass coupled with the highest amount of plant tissue and content. But yes, the other factor that you don't hear about is the C to N ratio as much, because that's the driver of availability. You know, that first one I described might tell you more about total nitrogen in the crop. And that's where you're doing that multiplication between biomass times tissue N percent. But then availability is really that C to N ratio, which is younger plant tissue, less lignaceous, you know, more easily available. And the other thing, which is a real factor, is moisture and incorporation, right? So microbes are doing the hard work of decomposing and mineralizing nitrogen. So microbes require water. And so thinking about springtime conditions, if you've had a dry winter and you incorporate your cover crop, everything could be right, but if your soil is dry, it's really not going to break down and become available. So that's another really significant factor for availability, is did it decompose? Were microbes able to access that material to actually break it down and make it available? And that's another thing you can think about is younger cover crops are going to have more moisture in them. And so when you incorporate that cover crop, you actually are incorporating quite a bit of water into the soil, which will facilitate that decomposition process. So moisture is a really big one. And then the incorporation factor. The more you chop it and incorporate it, the more surface area that becomes available from microbial degradation, and the more that would become available in that short term.
Great, thank you.
I know, it's a lot to try to put together.
Well, we are at the 4:30 mark, and maybe if you're up for it, Margaret, I would squeeze one more question.
Yeah, sure.
I have a bunch of questions, but I think this one, just, you know, I thought you might just give a freestyle comment on. I was very curious about the cover crop compost synergy that you were describing at the beginning, and both in terms of how you think it works, or how growers have seen it work. I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more about it, because I think that was really interesting.
Yeah, it is really interesting. Well, I think it can be hard to tease apart what's doing what in a system, and especially where we're doing both of these things pretty commonly. Those who are cover cropping are also using compost, and vice versa. So I don't know if I have that much more to add, but rather that was insightful for me too, and instructive to try to do that, tease apart what is doing what, because you know, sometimes it can be, you know, not obvious, or our own logic doesn't take us to where science takes us. And my example is, you know, I might have thought that compost, being microbially diverse, would promote microbial activity. Whereas this research was suggesting that the cover crops are promoting microbial activity more than compost. So it's, you know, really shaping my own understanding and our own understanding of how these different components are what they're doing in the soil. And so the cover crops, you know, we're literally feeding the microbes with the cover crops. The cover crops have more available soluble, digestible forms of carbon, which is microbial food. And that's what's feeding the microbes and stimulating that boom in microbial populations and biomass increase. And so there's a lot more food for the microbes in a cover crop than there is food for the microbes in a compost. And so I think that's kind of a little bit of that story there. You know, we hear about these C to N ratios a lot, and that's because of the microbial ratios, right? A microbe is 8 to 1, and they use carbon as their energy, and they also use that to maintain their bodies and for reproduction. And some of it gets lost in that process in carbon dioxide. And so that's how the sort of golden ratio of 24 to 1, you have 16 for the microbes energy and reproduction, and 8 is lost. And so this 24 to 1 is sort of that turning point in which all the material gets used. There's no excess carbon and there's no excess nitrogen. So when we have materials that are lower than 24 to 1, that's when we start to get the nitrogen excess. And so from a production standpoint, if we're wanting that nitrogen, we need material to be lower than that 24 to 1 because we need to have excess nitrogen. And to get enough excess nitrogen that it actually is valuable to a production system, we're really generally talking lower than 20 to 1. And so when we looked at those carbon to nitrogen ratios of the cereal crops, which were at 17, 18 to 1, they're pretty close to 20, and they're not leaving a lot of excess nitrogen. Whereas the vetches at 12 to 1 are leaving a lot more excess nitrogen. And so the microbes are getting their carbon that they need, and they're leaving, they have enough nitrogen for that carbon that there is nitrogen left over for our plants.
That was a really nice breakdown. Thank you, actually. That's and exciting for all of us who are into soil, soil biology in general.
Yeah, it's tricky, but yeah, the microbes are running the world, right?
But it highlights really the way that you can do different things with a cover crop. You can be aiming for providing that nitrogen, but with a higher carbon content, you build more soil organic matter, right?
Exactly. So it's more of a, having an awareness of what's going on and where the trade-offs are, and where the producer, can step in different ways to get out of the system what they need to meet their objectives.
Super. Well, we're at the 1.5 hour mark, so I think it's a good time to close. Thank you so very much, Margaret, for joining us and giving us this excellent presentation and discussion. Thank you for our attendees for your questions and
yes, thank you for having me. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm available. You can follow me on Instagram.